James Joyce's Finnegans Wake is a breakthrough text in the philosophy of language and the aesthetics of language. And in it, we really see the simultaneous birth of language, society, of history, and its destruction, which in a very Nietzschean way discusses the interrelationship between beginnings and ends, between creation and destruction. These are two sides of the same positive coin, which is the process of the universe unfolding, changing, and becoming. And there are rare passages where we get a very clear statement of the kinds of philosophical implications that Joyce has in mind in Finnegans Wake. Oftentimes the text is so layered with multiple voices and oftentimes contradictory ideas that it's difficult to get clarity, but every once in a while there are passages in which Joyce's intent breaks through and his philosophical implications really break through on the self-reflexivity of texts, on the possibility of multiple interpretations, as well as the role of norms in the construction of interpretation and communication through language. And in this lecture, I would like to look at a very famous passage from Joyce's Finnegans Wake, which is the abnihilisation of the etym, which has been often quoted as supposedly heralding the annihilation of the atom through the atomic bomb. And I want to connect this passage to a passage from Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus, where they discuss the idea of a homemade atomic bomb. And I see a lot of resonances between these passages. So I'll first kind of read through and interpret certain parts of the abnihilisation of the etym and talk about how this relates to the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari, using as well Finn Fordham's Lots of Fun at Finnegans Wake to help our interpretive journey. Now, the passage can be found on page 353 of Finnegans Wake, and we see the deconstruction and implosion of language, a sort of simultaneity of fusion and fission reactions. But we also see the birth of language itself, and we see a real conflict with the father implicit here, which stands for the law, for norms and authority and power, and we really see Joyce's textual economy kind of duplicating his hermeneutic questions and his self-reflexive understanding of the way that texts generate meaning. It goes as follows. The abnihilisation of the etym by the grisning of the grosning of the grinder of the grunder of the first Lord of Hertford explodo-detonates through Parseralia with an Ivan Morantharumble fragorumboacity andum which's general uttermost confusion are perceivable molotons scaping with molecules, which Coventry plumpkins fairly gosmother themselves in London elegance of pink and dinky. Similar sonatas are projectilized from Honolulu, Bulawayo, Imperial Realm, and modern atoms. They were precisely the 12s of clocks, noon minutes, none seconds. At Somseed of Oldenlang's Congerig by Donnybreak in era. Whew! Extremely dense passage, but lots of poetry going on here and rhythm and affect. There's a very kind of privileged encounter mode that we see here in the passage. And on the one hand, what we are looking at is the annihilation of the etym, that being the origin, think of the word etymology, of the origin of language of society itself. We're seeing a sort of postmodern understanding that we may have reached a point where in our progress towards truth, we realize that to get a historical kind of backlog of where we've come from, we've almost reached a wall past which we cannot see clearly. There's a sort of fuzzy barrier barring the subject from unearthing his or her own past, partly because of the fraught, contradictory nature of the present. This is often thematized in postmodern literature, where we have so many disparate elements and we come to the realization that we have no universalizing structure by which to order the elements. We have a sort of crisis of history which is happening here. We are actively witnessing the annihilation of the notion of origin, of Erfindung, as it's in German. But at the same time, the word is not annihilation, it's abnihilisation. But as Finn Fordham mentions in Lots of Fun at Finnegans Wake, annihilation is merely a distant echo of the actual word, the source word, which turns out to imply its opposite, describing the process of something emerging from nothing, ab nihil, thus referring to the act of originary creation, not of ultimate destruction, a fantasy perhaps more easy to imagine. The transliteration of Joyce's neologisms often, helpfully, narrows our options. So we might arrive at the from-nothingization of the first word. This looks back to the origin of the universe and may be responding to Georges Lemaitre's theory of the primeval atom, propounded in the 1920s. This theory was itself a source for the expanding universe model and the Big Bang theory proposed by Georges Gamow in 1948. So, right, it's almost as if we're seeing from some singularity the implosive, explosive capacity of creation itself, of some sort of vital originary point. Fordham continues, this passage does not concern the original creation of the material or spiritual universe, but the original creation from nothing of the linguistic universe, of the first word, of the root of all subsequent words. What is abnihilized is not the atom, but the etym, a rare word interchangeable with etymon, meaning the literal sense of a word from its origin. Such an origin of the linguistic universe is present in John's Gospel, where he announces that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. In John, the Word is the divine factor in the creation of the universe. Word and God are co-determiners for the universe. Joyce's is a comic, pathetic version, where God is a Dublin mayor and a physicist, producing the word and world out of nothing, not out of his own divinity, as if suddenly shouting, "Let the fireworks begin." There's an equivalent version in Hindu myth. The world came into being through the utterance of the Sanskrit word vas or vak, which is an expression of wonder, and also means speech, language, word, or voice. And that's what we're seeing here. Not only the disintegration, right, the detonating, the rumble of destruction, but also the primeval rumble of creation, which is kind of riffed on in Vico's philosophy of history, where history begins with the rumble and crack of thunder delivered down by God, which strikes fear into us and makes us create society. We're also seeing frag oromboacity, as in like a frag grenade, amid which is general uttermost confusion are perceivable, right? This is the general confusion of people who have received the thunder crack of God. Now they're scrambling about, trying to find themselves. And right, they're like molecules that are escaping from this state of nature and confusion, trying to find some solidity. But at the same time, this is the detonation of an Ivan Morin Thurumble, right? Someone named Ivan, some sort of Russian kind of almost phallically masculine name, who seems to be detonating with anger. This is like God is now a Russian man. And there's a very interesting word here, fairly gossmother themselves, which is a riff on fairy godmother, but they're fairly gossmothering, they're fairy godmothering themselves. They're almost their own ancestor. It is as if, in order to find the ancestry, we have to look inside to the contradictions and find the fairy godmother that is fairly there within ourselves. It's words which are our fairy godmother that testify to our past and allow us to produce a future. We also see in here atoms in which Athens and Atom are the same, right? And notably, this happens precisely the 12s of clocks, noon minutes, and none seconds. In other words, all of the clock hands are pointed directly, rigidly up, which is a common innuendo to erections in Finnegans Wake. There will be tons of times where the clock hands are all rigidly up like this, and it coincides with an erection or some kind of sexual fantasy from HCE or Shem or Sean, all these male characters. Therefore, Fordham states that in Finnegans Wake, the diversity of life, or the world or history, is being presented by someone who seems to have apprehended its compression, breadth, and irreducibility as much as any poet, scientist, or historian before him. This diversity is not something which, when presented as incomprehensible, leads to an existential anxiety. It does not coat valueless existence so much as the incalculable value of existence due to its transformations, as its manifestations move between positive being and nothingness, as they move in and out of life and death, wakefulness and sleep. And indeed, this is the dialectic that keeps Finnegans Wake moving. That on the broad hand, you have this kind of large cycle from the unfinished opening to the unfinished beginning of Finnegans Wake. But you also have micro cycles of constant creation and destruction and renewing that occur. It's like a cascading sort of Russian doll figure of Nietzsche's eternal return, where we constantly have repetition, which returns vis difference. This articulation of Nietzsche's doctrine of the eternal return is in fact the one that Deleuze gives us, and that segues us into the passage from A Thousand Plateaus, which can be found on pages 344 and 345. Deleuze and Guattari write that the more rarefied the atmosphere, the more disparate the elements you will find. Your synthesis of disparate elements will be all the stronger if you proceed with a sober gesture, an act of consistency, capture, or extraction that works in a material that is not meager, but prodigiously simplified, creatively limited, selected. For there is no imagination outside of technique. The modern figure is not the child or the lunatic, still less the artist, but the cosmic artisan. A homemade atomic bomb. It's very simple, really. It's been proven, it's been done. To be an artisan and no longer an artist, creator, or founder is the only way to become cosmic, to leave the milieus and the earth behind. The invocation to the cosmos does not at all operate as a metaphor. On the contrary, the operation is an effective one from the moment the artist connects a material with forces of consistency or consolidation. And a lot of this really mirrors Joyce's project of combining forces of consistency and consolidation in a way where we have a number of uniquely, unpersonally individuated intensities, such as meteorological events, or historical breaking points, or personal struggles and ambiguities. And all of these move and mold between each other in such a way that they are consolidated to form a hyper-densified textual economy. And through this density, we create a rarefied atmosphere. We pack it full of intensities such that it moves as an autonomous unit, as something which can be bound into a number of pages, and yet which enters onto the cosmic, which transcends through its going onto to the subterranean forces of the earth. And this is an important implication of Joyce and Nietzsche and Artaud and Deleuze and Guattari, who I all see as part and parcel of this kind of unified, although of course different, aesthetic project by which to chart a personal and a cultural path forward through the unearthing of the past in its narrative components, in understanding the way that truth and narrative and hermeneutics are all part of a single package, which is indeed what Finnegans Wake is. It is a hermeneutic project, it's also a narrative project, and a psychological and personal project, and it is a social project of unearthing the various influences that went behind the production of Finnegans Wake, the environment that Joyce found himself in, the figures and allusions that we find in Finnegans Wake, and all of this is combined into what I would see as a sober gesture. Oftentimes, Finnegans Wake is critiqued as being too extreme, that if you look at the textual history of work in progress up to the time that it became Finnegans Wake, a lot of critics say that there's a point in which he went past this productive multiplicity of language into the point of total obscurity, and that in fact this isn't a sober gesture. But the way that Joyce works his textual economy by packing it in so deep with allusions which nevertheless flow so well together through Joyce's idiomatic Irish poetry style, I think this actually makes for a very sober gesture in which he has made an atomic bomb, something which fuses together a number of atomic elements, which is in fact concept that Deleuze and Guattari talk about all the time, of selecting basic units and putting them in confluence in a way where they implode and therefore explode. I think this all comes together to make actually a very coherent project, which of course has lots of structure from Vico's philosophy of history, from various elements of Joyce's life, from various stories and nursery rhymes and things like that. There is a lot of structure here. But at the same time, it's constantly playing with this dialectic between structure and the inverse of the same side of the coin, which is chaos. And I think this fight is what makes both Joyce and Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy and writing so exciting. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful in condensing these two seemingly disparate figures together. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member if you'd like for $5 a month and gain access to a private philosophy Zoom, which I host the second Sunday of every month at 2 p.m. Central. You can tailor it to your needs. If you need help with reading a text or talking about some philosophy problem, it's open to you. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate a single time to the channel, because it helps out a lot, kind of takes some pressure off me buying all these books, but no pressure, care about yourself first. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.